why do you think that critical race theory and the 1619 Project are such political hot potatoes?
Well, I'm glad that they're getting attention. None of this is new, but I think we need to understand what's really going on here. Critical race theory and the 1619 Project, these are both weapons created by enemies of liberty, enemies of civilization, enemies of our nation, for the purpose of breaking down all of those things. It's with communists, it's always been this idea that the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. So the people peddling this at the highest levels, this is not really about race or racial justice or anything like that for them. This is about undermining America, dividing the population for the purpose of advancing the revolution. We can start off by pointing out that critical race theory and the 1619 Project are both based on absolute demonstrable lies. It can be easily shown that these things are false. So let's start with critical race theory. Critical race theory is actually a subset of critical theory, and this comes directly out of Marxism. Okay, Karl Marx figured out understood that you needed conflict to be able to advance this totalitarian vision that he had. If you had a peaceful, unified, harmonious, prosperous society, you could not advance this revolution. And so he wanted to destroy certain things. One of those things that he wanted to destroy was the nuclear family. And we see that now just it's such a hot issue in schools. Another thing that he recognized needed to happen was to create this fault line. And so he divided people up into oppressors and oppressed. His original vision was that the oppressors were the bourgeoisie and the oppressed were the proletariat. That idea kind of worked in Russia because Russia was a very different type of society. They also had enormous backing from some of the most wealthy capitalists in the world, incidentally, many of them on Wall Street. This is very well documented in the book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. So when you have these poisonous ideas, you have a restless population already, you have a very unequal totalitarian society like Tsarist Russia was, and you have huge amounts of money from the mega bankers in the West, yeah, you can orchestrate a successful revolution there. However, when you try to tell Americans, for example, or Western Europeans, hey guys, you're all being oppressed by these evil capitalists, like, wait a minute, what? We're super wealthy. We have the option, the possibility to work hard and move up in the world. If making a lot of money is our thing, hey, this is a free country. We can devote ourselves and we can start a business and we can be successful too. And so that really didn't go over well in most of the Western world. And so the communists went back to the drawing board and they said, crud, I guess that's not going to work. Well, that doesn't mean that Marx is wrong. It just means that we need to tailor the strategy here to bring that about. So what they figured out, this really came out of the Frankfurt School, which migrated over to Columbia University, where John Dewey was. They said, well, hey, let's create a new fault line. Let's say that race is the fault line then. Let's create this new category of oppressor and oppressed. Let's say that the oppressed are any non-whites and the oppressors are whites. So that's the idea they came up with now. Now they've added a whole bunch of new categories in there. Now, if you're cisgender, you're part of the oppressor class. If you are heterosexual, you're part of the oppressor class. If you're a male, you're part of the oppressor class. So they've again divided up society into oppressor and oppressed for obvious reasons, right? Jesus taught in the New Testament that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So if you can divide the society down whatever lines, it really is not all that important to the Marxists what fault line they use. It's just important that there be that fault line and that you get people arguing amongst each other, ultimately going into overt conflict. Then you can bring down that society and you can replace it, build on the ashes, this Marxist vision that they want. So that's what critical race theory is based on. And as you go through their fundamental presuppositions, you find that they're all based on lies. First of all, Christians should automatically be able to recognize these lies. Right? If you read your Bible, you'll see that God does not divide people up by races. God talks about certain ways that people should be treated. Really, these things would be an impossibility in a Christian society. It's not to say that there have never been any racial issues in America. Certainly there have been. But the idea that America is today a systematically racist country or that white supremacy is holding everybody down is patently ridiculous. And that's why they have to come up with lies. That's why they have to create false narratives like they created around, for example, some of these shootings that we saw, right? If you interview your average American after all this exposure to the toxic fake media and the brainwashing in the schools, they think that American police are these racist yahoos just running around searching for black people to shoot. That is absolutely preposterous. The data shows that to be preposterous. It shows it to be an absolute lie. And yet this is an integral part of the push for looking at the world through this lens of critical race theory, the idea that the police are being used to suppress minorities. In fact, quite the opposite is true. The people who were really asking for and begging for increased police protection were black leaders, right? They didn't want their communities to be terrorized. Nobody wants that. There's nothing racist about black policemen stopping criminals in black communities. That's absolutely preposterous. In fact, that is a racist lie. So they've built this whole ideology, this whole worldview on lies. Then in comes the 1619 Project. Now, the 1619 Project is intimately tied to critical race theory, but it even goes beyond that. It completely rewrites American history. See, American history is incredible. It's something that every American can and should be proud of. There has been this scourge known as slavery that has existed in virtually every human culture for virtually all of human history, all over planet Earth. It existed all over Africa. It existed all over Asia. It existed all over the Mesoamerican territory. Right? The Incas practiced massive slavery. The Aztecs practiced slavery and cannibalism and human sacrifice. These are things that have been with humanity since the dawn of time. Then along comes this new civilization, if you will, the Anglo-Saxon civilization, kind of Britain, the United States, based on Christian principles. And the Bible says you can't steal a man's life. In fact, it's a capital offense for you to kidnap a person and enslave them. And so based on these ideas, they come up with these governing documents, our Declaration of Independence, for example, that says that we are all created equally, and we are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So out of the Bible flow these ideas that are at the foundation of our government. And for the first time in all of human history, along with our cousins in Britain, although many American states banned slavery long before the Brits did, but this is something that really we should be proud of, right? After all this horrible thousands of years of human history where people were enslaving each other and eating each other and genociding each other, along come these societies, these cultures that say, no, that's not appropriate. We're going to be stopping that here for the first time in human history. And we're not going to be content with just stopping it here. In fact, we're going to insist that it be stopped everywhere because it's such an outrage on human dignity. You don't have to be Christian, but you have to recognize that you can't make another person your slave. And you know, these ideas didn't catch on for a long time. If we're honest, I mean, in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, slavery was still legal 50 years ago. In parts of Africa, slavery was still legal less than 20 years ago, right? Mauritania didn't make slavery a crime until 2007. Okay, how can they say that America is this uniquely evil society when Americans were the first ones, along with the Brits, to end this scourge? It really is absolutely ludicrous. And so that is the narrative of the 1619 Project. If you read these essays by this racist lunatic, Hannah Nicole Jones from the New York Times, their own fact checker said they couldn't publish this because it was so outrageously wrong. They published it anyway. But the premise is, and she says this explicitly, that racism and slavery and oppression are in America's DNA. Well, if the problem is in your DNA, there's nothing you can do to stop that, right? You can't reform yourself. You can't apologize. You can't be a better, even reparations is not going to get that out of your DNA. There's nothing you can do except murder the patient, right? Get rid of this racist monster with this racist DNA and from the ashes, rebuild something new. And again, it's based on lies at every step of the way. First of all, it frames it exactly the opposite of the truth. It frames it as America's uniquely evil when in fact, America's uniquely good. We got rid of slavery here and then we did it everywhere else. But even on the specific points, right? They talk about the alleged slaves that came over in 1619. If you go read that narrative, what you'll find is it's absolutely false. The Africans who were brought over here were actually brought over here as indentured servants, same as many of the Europeans who were brought here from Ireland and from other places. The very first legal slave owner in Virginia and in the British colonies in North America was actually a black man, right? Why wouldn't you mention that if you're trying to reframe American history? Why wouldn't you point out that the first ever legal slave owner in in America was a black man, an African by the name of Antonio Johnson. He came over here as an indentured servant from Angola, from Portuguese Angola, and he eventually got his freedom because, again, he was an indentured servant. There wasn't slavery at that time in the colony of Virginia. Once he got free from his indentured servitude, which was for a defined period of time, he started acquiring indentured servants himself, including, incidentally, European indentured servants. Then he sued, and he got a judgment in a court of law that allowed him to keep one of his indentured servants in perpetuity, thereby making him the first slave owner in America. If you're going to talk about this early history, and I think we should, history is important, we should all learn it, why would you leave out something like that from your narrative? And you find this all throughout the entire narrative, Christine. You see this recently with the effort to create this Juneteenth holiday and try to tell Africans or Americans of African heritage that Independence Day, July 4th, that has nothing to do with them. That's for white people. Black people now have their own Independence Day, Juneteenth. That's baloney, right? If they had taught real history, they'd know that the very first martyr in the cause of American independence was a black man named Crispus Attucks. He was the first man who gave his life for the cause of American independence, and yet he's been completely wiped out of the history textbooks. Why? Because he exposes the fraudulent narrative that they're trying to sell. They want division. They don't want a united American people, united around the ideas that God created us equally, God gave us rights, and we institute government to protect these rights, because that would mean we can't have a Marxist takeover. We can't tear down the freest, most prosperous society in human history. And, they couldn't just come out and brainwash adults 100 years ago with these lies, because they'd say, no, that's not real history. Why are you teaching me fake history? So that's why the important element of this plan has been to brainwash the children. And it gets worse and worse with every generation, to the point now where very, very few Americans have any understanding of early American history. All they have is this poisonous lie in their minds that was put there by the fake education system, the government indoctrination system, and then later reinforced by the fake media. And if we don't deal with this, it will kill the patient. It will accomplish exactly what the Marxists want, and that is destroy America so that a new totalitarian system can emerge in its place.
Wow, so well put. And thank you so much. And Alex, don't you, as I understand, there's a real effort to drive a wedge between parents and state, that ideally they would love for the children to be the children of the schools, the state, the system, and that there's, don't ask your parents, we've got a helicopter mom and a snowplow dad, I think they call them. And as I understand that even like some laptops or Chromebooks have facial recognition features in them, that like with the remote learning where the parent says, oh, Johnny, what are you doing today? I want to see what you're doing on your screen. And as soon as the screen sees a parent, it goes black, and that's my big thing, that these things are happening in schools. But are the parents afforded an opportunity when they drop their child off, trusting that all is well in the schools? Are they afforded an opportunity to have a clue what goes on, or weigh in, have consent that this is happening, to make a really well-informed decision where to place their child for the next school year?
There is absolutely an effort to keep parents in the dark about what's going on in the public school systems. In fact, this came out during COVID when a lot of the children were at home doing government brainwashing at home. They asked parents to sign these forms that we're not going to look at what's coming through the computer. Why in the world would you? Oh, it's for privacy purposes. We just don't want you to be able to see the other kids. What? That makes absolutely no sense. So there is an effort to deprive parents of knowledge about what's going on. And the reason why is obvious, right? With each year that passes, the system gets more and more radicalized. So an American adult who went to government schools maybe in the 80s or 90s, they grew up with a certain level of brainwashing, but of course they couldn't go for the whole enchilada in one go. Well, now 20 or 30 years later, the indoctrination has become much more extreme. And so even if a parent brainwashed in the 90s were to see what the children are being brainwashed with today, they would be outraged. They would be horrified. And so there is this concerted effort all across the United States to keep parents in the dark. And we've seen this over and over and over again. We actually have some school districts where they've sent out emails to teachers telling them to even create fake curricula and fake resources to show the parents so that they wouldn't have to show the real thing. And this is part of an effort to drive a wedge between children and their parents. Totalitarians have understood for at least 100 years that this is the route to consolidating and achieving total power. Adolf Hitler really pioneered a lot of this, the National Socialist leader, dictator of Germany, who, by the way, was elected initially. He understood that we're not going to be able to get the bitter clingers, as Obama called them, right? The ones who cling to their guns and their Bibles, as Obama famously quipped.
Hadn't heard that. Bitter
Yeah.
clingers.
Yeah. So Obama, he gave a talk in Pennsylvania, and he attacked the bitter clingers clinging to their guns and their Bibles and who are not pleased with what's happening. So the bitter clinger, the establishment knows that there are older Americans who still value the ideas of America, who still value individual freedom and so on. They don't want their children to be brainwashed. And so you have this effort to drive this wedge in between. And again, Hitler was the pioneer here. He actually was the first world leader to make it a crime for parents to homeschool their own children. He herded all the children into these government brainwash camps called public schools. And then that wasn't enough. Then he created the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, to make sure that even after school, their parents wouldn't really have a lot of influence on them because they'd be doing their Hitler Youth marches and whatever. And so that was the goal, to separate children from their parents, to teach children that their parents were stupid and old-fashioned and they didn't know, how great the new world was going to be and all the rest of this revolutionary nonsense. And this is what dictators have done throughout the last 100 years. We've seen it over and over and over again in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Angola, in Mozambique, everywhere where the communists and Marxists take over. This is exactly what we see. We saw the same thing in Cuba. And now we're seeing it in America, right? We're seeing children being told, and they say this explicitly, right? They say this in some of the sex ed materials, for example. Well, your parents, they might be old fashioned and they might have these old values where, they put these moral strings on sexual relations. But, that's just old fashioned stuff. You don't need to pay attention to that. Now, research shows that promiscuity is good for you. And if you were born in the wrong body, maybe you need transgender treatments and stuff. And they hide a lot of this from parents. I've downloaded some of these documents right from government websites, right? The school district websites, state board of education websites. They've got things like a gender transition forms and individual support plans while you're transitioning to a new gender, where they ask the children, are your parents aware that you're now calling yourself, Lily instead of David, right? Well, no, my parents aren't aware. So then the school makes a plan for, well, okay, when you're at school, we'll call you Lily. When your parents are around, we'll call you David, so that your parents don't figure out that we're helping you transition. This is an outrage. This is an abomination. It should be considered a crime, right? Parents have a prior right to raise their children and to make decisions for their children. That's why God gave parents children and children parents, right? There's a reason why the state was not put in charge of raising children, why parents were putting in charge. And nobody loves children more than their parents. That's obvious. It's a self-evident fact from biology. And yet now we're seeing this concerted effort to separate parents from their children. And we're seeing the fruit of that too. It's a disaster.
Absolutely. And I understand, like, picking up a little bit with the critical race theory, that it's not unusual for white children to feel guilty for being white and for feeling sorry for their non-white friends for past all of that. But and I also understand that, like you talk about the changing of the history, the rewriting of the history, and it's just so wrong. And I was talking with someone about they're removing things like literature from school, Shakespeare, whatever, to make room for maybe sex education, things like that. I also understand that they're pulling out parts from classic books like Huckleberry Finn. The character Injun Joe, he's now being referred to as Hipster Joe. Had you heard that?
I had not, but it doesn't surprise me. So.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, that's just amazing. But well, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, and I think we should maybe shift over to some solutions. And I'm wondering if you have some uplifting words, Alex, to share with our audience, so they, in case they might feel a little bit overwhelmed and concerned about where they're going, and what might they do to unpack this situation, to see how they want to, make an informed decision about what their next step should be.